As we approach the November general election and Americans are beginning to make their voting plans, we want to take a moment to discuss potential voting methods and how voters can find what options are available to cast a ballot in their state. As with all things related to elections, in the United States, there are three important points to remember. U.S. elections are administered at the state and local government levels. Their voting methods therefore vary significantly from state to state according to state laws. Often the same or similar practices are called different things in different states. This makes it difficult to address these issues nationally, but remember, you only need to understand the method of voting in your state. Voters should get their trusted election information directly from their state and local election officials. We have a panel of three distinguished gentlemen with us today. First off, we have NASS President and Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon. Secretary Simon is joined by Chairman and Commissioner Ben Hovland of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission and Vice Chairman and Commissioner Don Palmer of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Secretary Simon, I'm going to start with you. NASS is celebrating Trusted Info 2024 week. As NASS president, will you please describe our Trusted Info initiative and why it's important?
Yes. Well, Trusted Info, first and foremost, is centered on the voters. And the idea is that the voters should have the most complete and accurate information before they cast their vote. There's a lot out there, whether it's on social media or in political circles, about what the rules are or what the laws are. And some of it is accurate. Some of it, though, isn't. Some of it is myth, some of it is rumor, and it's easy for voters to get confused. So what's great about the Trusted Info 2024 initiative is it is just that, an effort to connect voters with the most trusted and accurate information. And we think the easiest and clearest way to do that is to seek out information from secretaries of state and other more local election administrators. So Trusted Info aims to connect people with those resources in their particular state, a Secretary of State's office or a county or a city and the like, so that they can get that information from the practitioners, the folks actually running the elections.
Thank you. One thing I would also note is for folks who want to follow their state or local election officials on social media, that'll bring that information directly to them. Not a lot of people follow their state and local election officials, but this is especially a good time of year to do that. Chair Hovland, as previously mentioned, voting methods and the terminology used to describe voting methods vary across the United States depending on state laws. Please broadly describe the methods of casting a ballot used in U.S. elections.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Leslie. It's great to be here. Great to be talking about voting. When I think about the different ways people can vote around the country, I really think about it as two big buckets. And the first is really in-person voting. That's probably the way most Americans, when they think about voting, think about that. That's, whether that's on election day or in advance of election day, but that in-person voting experience. And then the other that is becoming more common is using the mail in some way. And usually that's that you get a mail ballot delivered to you, and then you may mail that back. You may drop it off at a local office, or you may drop it at a drop box, depending on your state law. Over the years, I've voted in all of those ways. They all work equally good. What it really comes down to is what your state allows and what works best for you as a voter.
Okay, Vice Chair Palmer, please provide some examples of how voting methods and terminology differ depending on the state.
Well, I think one of the ways is, as Chairman Hovland mentioned, early voting. That can mean a couple of different things. In some states, they're going to call it early voting. Some might call it advanced voting or an in-person absentee period of voting. That may be a period of time, but it's going to be delineated by state law. And really, sometimes localities have some flexibility. They may have 2 weeks of early voting or 10 days. They may have some flexibility. So you really need to check with your local election official to make sure, well, you know what the early voting period is, when you might expect an absentee or mail ballot to be coming to you. and where you can vote early. For example, it may only be at the office, the election office, or it may be at an early voting site. They may call it something else. They may call it a vote center. So it really just begs the question, you really should check your local election official's website to see where and when you can vote early. And then to make things a little bit more confusing, but not really, is we call it mail voting. Sometimes states and localities will call it absentee voting, where you make that request for a ballot. Sometimes they'll send that to you. This is why it's really important to understand how your locality handles the mail ballots. Be aware of when you can request them or it's going to be in your mailbox. And then don't procrastinate. Make sure you vote and get that sent back to the office in a timely manner.
Exactly right. Secretary Simon, will you please give us a state example? Talk a little bit about how it's done in Minnesota.
In terms of early voting in particular?
Early
Yes.
voting, absentee voting, yes.
Right. And again, just for folks taking this in, this too is something that varies, as the commissioners have said, from state to state to state. And there are various deadlines both before and after a person votes. So I'll give you the Minnesota example, but again, the disclaimer here is it may be different in your state. So in Minnesota, there is no deadline to order what we call an absentee ballot, that early voting period, which we have, which in Minnesota is about a month and a half before the election. But again, in other states, it might be 30 days or 20 days, that early voting or absentee voting or advance voting period. In Minnesota, it's 46 days, and there's no deadline. You could technically, in my state, order an absentee ballot the day before the election. I wouldn't advise it because it's not going to get there until afterwards, but there's no legal deadline. Similarly, in terms of after the person votes, we are not a postmark state. Some are, California and several others are postmark states, where if you want to mail that back, as long as it's postmarked by election day, that's okay. Not the case in my state. In Minnesota, it has to get there, back to whatever office or entity sent it to you, a county or city or what have you. You have to get it there by the time the polls close on election day. Any way you can. You can drop it off. You can, under some circumstances, give it to a spouse or a neighbor or a friend with some limitations. But those are the rules in Minnesota. But I caution everyone to check out the rules in your state as to the duration of that early voting period, as to any deadline by which you've got to order the ballot if it isn't automatically sent to you, and the rule for getting it back. Is it a postmark rule in your state, or like in Minnesota, is it no, you have to get it back by that date? So those are some of the things that vary from state to state. I just gave you a Minnesota example, but understanding that that could be different in any particular state.
Thank you. Yes. And one of the things that NASS did many, many years ago is develop a website called canivote.org. And the reason that we did it is because we were receiving a lot of phone calls, as well as some of the voter outreach groups, asking some very basic questions. Am I registered to vote? How can I check my registration status? Where's my polling place? Voter ID requirements in my state? What are the early and absentee voting requirements in my state? And how to become a poll worker. So we put this all together on canivote.org. And what we do is we don't collect anybody's information. We link directly to the place on the state website that has the answer to that exact question. So we have, we have access to all the state websites. We direct you to the exact place on that state website that will provide you information on the early and absentee voting requirements in the state. Secretary Simon, I'd like to turn back to you for this question. In several states, all registered voters receive a mail ballot. But in most states, voters need to request a mail ballot. From the broad national perspective, what should a voter keep in mind when it comes to the timing of requesting and returning a mail ballot? And how can they determine if their ballot has been received by election officials and ultimately counted?
So let me take the last one first, because it's a question that we get a lot in this business and in this space, which is, well, how do I know if I vote by absentee or vote by mail? Am I just saying a prayer and putting it in the mailbox and hoping that it gets there? No. In many states, maybe not all, but at many states, you can track that absentee ballot or that mail ballot just like you would an Amazon package or a UPS package. There's a code and a number, and you can determine with certainty whether it has arrived, and in yet more states, including my state, whether it's been processed. So you have that peace of mind. It didn't just arrive, it's been processed, etc. In terms of other deadlines, again, some states have a deadline before ordering that. They might say that you can only order an absentee or early or advanced ballot, say a week before the election or 2 weeks before the election. In our state, we have no such deadline. And then afterwards, there is a similar issue of when you've got to get it back. In Minnesota, that's by polls, the time that the polls close on election night. But in other states, that's not the case. You can have it postmarked by election day as long as it arrives within some specified period afterwards. And some states are all over the map on that. Some say it has to arrive within a few days. Some say a week. Some say, I think, 10 days. Some, I think, maybe even longer. But that's why the Can I Vote website is so important and such a key resource for people, because you can really zero in on what the requirement is in your state. And I think you're so right, Leslie, the way you put it at the end, or at the beginning, I should say, which is that, yes, we're a nation of 50 states with 50 very individualistic and different ways of doing things, but all you got to remember is your state. And NASS and the EAC both can really help direct you towards those resources that pertain only to you in your particular state.
Thank you. Vice Chair Palmer, although many voters begin casting their ballots before Election Day, the reporting of results does not begin until election night, and even those results are unofficial. What should voters do about the processing? What should voters know about the processing and tabulation of ballots, regardless of the voting method that they choose?
Well, if a voter has cast a ballot, they've done their job. Our job is then to count those ballots. And every ballot, if it's by mail, early voting, or on election day, are going to be counted. And so those first unofficial results, those are unofficial. They're not final. We have not counted all the ballots. Now, the media or others might project a winner or project how the race may go, but the election officials are going to count those ballots. There are provisional ballots that are cast that they have to do research before counting. There's going to be overseas and military, for example. There are going to be some delays or ballots that need to be counted over the couple of days after the election, but every ballot will be counted. And when those results are finalized after being audited and canvassed, those are going to be sent to the state for final certification. And really, when they're finally certified, the results are final, and those go to the winners of the election or to the Congress, for example, with the Electoral College.
Thank you, sir. As we close, I want to reflect on what Trusted Info 2024 means to you and all Americans. I'd love to hear from you all on what Trusted Info 2024 makes you think of when you hear that phrase. Secretary Simon, why don't we start with you and then go to Chair Hovland and then Vice Chair Palmer?
I think it's about accuracy and integrity, making sure we're centering the voters in this discussion. This is about voters getting accurate information about what the system is, what the rules are in their particular area, in their particular state. So I think about it as a way to ensure integrity, a way to ensure that voters get what they need so that they can make their own decisions.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's about getting the right info. You know, there's a lot of information out there, and certainly, some of that is not the right information for you, and whether that's malicious or if it's just accidental. I live in the Washington D.C. area. Our nightly news, they might say, "Hey, early voting started today," and it did in Virginia, but it didn't in Maryland or DC or West Virginia that are all in that media market. And so again, critical to get your information that is right for you in the state and jurisdiction that you're in. And so that's why we talk about going to your state and local election officials for that accurate information for how you as an American can participate?
I would simply say that if you're going to vote, you should really have a plan to vote, and you should have all the pertinent information in front of you of what your options are in voting. It's important that you can trust your local and state election officials, because this is what they do for a living. So they got to make sure that that information is accurate for their voters. And as Commissioner Hovland pointed out, others want to assist in the process of just generally informing the public, but they may not have the specifics for you to make sure you can accurately vote. So that's my advice, is to go to the trusted sources, which are state and local election officials who have that information pertinent to you.
Thank you. Chair Hovland and Vice Chair Palmer and NASS President Steve Simon. In closing, I would like to thank the Election Assistance Commission for supporting the NASS Trusted Info 2024 initiative and for being such a good partner to NASS and to the state and local election officials. It's a simple message. Election officials are the trusted sources for accurate, up-to-date election information, but it's really important. Voters do not need to search far and wide for the election information they need. Instead, they should go straight to their trusted source. I thank you all today for joining us, and I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.